Changing perceptions of African art. Africa was known to the ancient world for the power, wealth, and artistic magnificence, and was a place with thriving art productions during much of Europe's Dark Ages. Great inland art centers, such as Zimbabwe and Ile-Ife, were flourishing at this time and have left behind striking evidence of the aesthetic and cultural complexity of powerful indigenous political systems. Africa has also been host to larger artistic encounters. Early on, Nubia, and later Ethiopia, became important global sites of Christianity, with local rulers commissioning handsome works of painting, sculpture, and architecture, conjoining the new concerns with indigenous African aesthetic vibrancy. Africa also played a crucial role in the development and expansion of Islam. Timbuktu became the home to one of the world's most important universities, its large library specializing in law. The kings of Mali, which controlled much of the world's gold trade at this time, were royalty beyond compare. In addition to the gold-ornamented horse trappings and other decorative arts made in Mali, court builders created magnificent multi-storied architectural projects using local earth. During this period, 11th to 15th centuries, East Coast cities such as Zanzibar were said to be among the most handsome in the world, both for their inhabitants' elegant fashions of dress and for their unique traditions of decorative coral architecture. Asian merchants sought out these rich East African ports and interior markets, leaving behind large quantities of export ceramics and other materials that have been important for the dating of sites. In the 16th through 18th centuries, Africa continued to be known as a place of powerful kings and lavish courts. In this era of broad-based sea exploration, many European travelers to Africa compared the continent's court architecture and thriving cities favorably with the best of Europe. They also brought home ivories, textiles, and other artwork that eventually found their way into the collections of the most distinguished art patrons and artists of Europe. Even during the horrors of the slave trade, which resulted in inconceivable personal suffering, massive political instability in much of Africa, and the transportation of a significant proportion of Africa's own essential labor force to the Americas to provide for the West's industrialization drive, outside observers continue to hold highly favorable views of Africa and its art. The generally positive images of Africa changed dramatically in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Western desire for greater control over Africa's trade partners, religious beliefs, and political engagements led to an era of widespread colonial expansion. Consistent with the aims of 19th century colonialism, Africa was then frequently described in published accounts as a place of barbaric cultural practices and heinous ruling. If art was mentioned at all, it tended to be in negative terms. Charles Darwin's theories of biological evolution have had a negative impact and were used to support popular parallel theories of social evolution that falsely maintain that African society, as well as those of other minority peoples such as American Indians, Indonesians, Irish, and peasants more generally, represented a lower level of humanity, indeed an earlier prototype within the human evolutionary sequence. Arts and other contributions of these societies were similarly disparaged as lacking in rational foundation, true innovation, and sustained cultural accomplishment. For example, when the great archaeological finds at Ile-Ife were discovered at the beginning of the 20th century, it was wrongly assumed that a group of lost Europeans was responsible for these technically and aesthetically sophisticated sculptures. With the growth of colonial interest in Africa, writing about the special fabric of its arts also changed. Africa was described primarily as a place of separate and fixed tribal entities which lacked sophisticated political and economic institutions as well as broad-based authority. This was also the period when many major European collections of art were started. Wealthy state treasuries of kingdoms such as Benin, Ashanti, and Dahomey, and their accumulated arts, were taken to Europe as war booty following the defeat of their rulers by European forces, and formed the basis of the rich collections of newly founded ethnographic museums. And the literature of the time, the broad regional influences of these kingdoms were often played down in favor of narrow ethnic identities. Regional dialects of larger language groups in turn became erroneously identified as distinct fixed languages, each supposedly unique to a separate, quote, tribe and artistic, quote, style. Tribalism between the predominant framework within which the continent's art production was discussed, and to some extent the model of this distinctive ethnic group, tribe, survives today. The Christian arts of Nubia and Ethiopia were rarely, if ever, discussed alongside other African works. Earlier maps highlighting Africa's impressive royal capital, inland cities, and material resources were largely replaced with new maps showing small-scale, rigidly fixed cultural boundaries, each unique to one tribe and one art style, which were again falsely presumed to have existed for much of history. What was mistakenly called a distinct tribal style in the early 20th century was often the result of the iconographic requirements of a particular image type. Today, we also know that a number of artworks were created in one place and culture, yet used in another. Many Magabitu works were made by Azande artists. A significant number of Bamun artists were from the grassland culture. Some of the most important Dahomey artists were of Yoruba or Mahe origin, and many Busum, Kuba, and Ashanti art genres have also had foreign influence origins. The long-standing and problematic label of tribal art has had a negative impact on the field African art, and meant that until recently little academic interest was shown in the historical dimensions of these arts or the names of individual artists. This is in part explains why far fewer dates and artistic attributions are available to us than is the case in other comparable art surveys. Other problematic views by colonial authorities influenced the early classification of African art within the larger context of world art history. In keeping with the now long disproven social evolutionary theories, early social scientists identified African art as a form of primitive art, indicating that African artworks, regardless of age, were necessarily primeval. Textbooks of the early 20th century present all African arts as similar to prehistoric works or to the arts of children. Even early modern artists, such as Picasso, assumed that African art was based upon primal impulses. They did not realize that African art is as intellectual and intentional as Western own, nor did they appreciate the degree to which African artists were grappling with the art historical traditions of their culture as well as with new, important ideas and art forms. Partly as a result of African art's primitive label, and even though today most art historians acknowledge its importance to the development of European modernism, too few African artists are credited for their understanding of the unique intellectual and formal possibilities of abstraction, or for utilizing the vital aesthetic power of collage and assimilates, both of which were so central to the development of Western Cubism. Thus, whereas many 20th century artworks in Western museums bear the label abstract art, the comparable and much earlier abstract works made by African artists generally are not so labeled. It is assumed, wrongly, that Western abstract works alone are intellectualized and intentional, while abstract arts by African artists are a result of errors in trying to copy from nature. Comparable misunderstandings have also been frustrating for contemporary African artists, seeking to gain wider acceptance for their art because their use of abstraction and similar modern idioms is seen by some critics as derivative of the West. African artists who seek to address contemporary essays or subject matter in their works face similar problems.